Well, Gene, I thought we would start a little bit with why is TPA caught wildfire? Maybe a little bit of a take on why this has just reached a fever pitch, in my views. And particularly, I would say in the last year, it's been building. Kaya's been focused on this for longer than that, as I'm sure you have too. But has it been some combination of market conditions, the state of the world, investment options? What has caused this to kind of continue to evolve in its top of mind perspective?
John, thank you for having me. Happy to go back and forth with you on TPA. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've been thinking about it and writing about it for a while now, as you know, and I think that what's been going on over the last couple of years is that several existing strands have been woven together in a much more coherent investment and government framework. But I want to point out that these strands are not new. When I think through TPA, when I think about the way that it comes together, the holistic approach, the focus on liability and objectives, risk factors as a common language, right? Alignment in terms of org design, competition for capital, and the opportunity cost of every investment. When you stand these things on their own, they're not new, right? These ingredients have been around for a long time. I started my career in the early 2000s. LBI, liability driven investing for corporate plans, was just coming to these shores from the UK. And that focus on the whole portfolio, assets and liabilities together, surplus optimization, risk factors to define the liability and the return seeking portfolio, right? These things again are not new. I think another contributing factor, though, that may be a little bit newish is the availability and the power of risk systems that sit on the desktops of asset owners. Right? Increasingly, in the conversations that I'm having globally with asset owners, the dashboards and the depth to which they very deeply understand their investments has been frankly surprising and welcoming. And I think that that's because there are great tools available from third-party providers, from other asset managers that just provide a lot more clarity on what's going on in the portfolio. And once you have that sort of clarity, you kind of ask yourself, like, why am I just using this for backwards looking attribution? I want to be using this for forward looking portfolio construction. And I think that's where TPA provides a really nice on ramp there. A couple of other thoughts on why is this popular and why is it popular right now? How is it becoming more popular now? Is that when I think through strategic asset allocation, and I have a lot of thoughts on SAA. Most of them are orthodox, but not all of them. When I think about the evolution of SAA over the last, let's say, 70 years, what I've observed is a real overspecification in the way that portfolios are put together and in potentially what constitutes an asset class or what people think an asset class is. And as you get to this point where you have so many different slivers of the pie chart in SAA and you have these overly specified, highly correlated pieces of the portfolio, at some point you take a step back and you ask yourself, like, what's the common thread across these? What is the common factor exposure? And I think there's a short gap, a small gap from that mindset to, like, wait a second, there is a more holistic way to think about the entire portfolio once I've got this understanding and these tools, and I can see some of the friction that is being provided by today's more traditional SAA framework. So I'd love the chance to talk about some of these more significant issues in turn, and I'm sure that we'll get there in the conversation. But again, it seems like there's a lot of things coming together for the why right now moment.
I like the way you put it, perhaps slightly paraphrasing the idea that the apparatus, the tool set has caught up with the worldview a bit. And that's perhaps created this perfect storm of adoption and of interest. You also talked about this tension of some of this stuff having been around a long time, but perhaps it's reached this point where it's coming together in new ways. And I'd like to press Gene on that a little bit, because there are some skeptics out there that simply say things like, this is just new jargon, new words, a new layer of platitudes for all the stuff we've been doing and I've been preaching for so long. But I think there are actually some impactful differences, either because you're putting all these things together, or perhaps you're evolving well past that into a new model. Can you try to pinpoint kind of the crucible key elements that are truly different than SAA?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple things that we really do need to focus on that makes TPA different in kind, not different in degree from SAA. But I'm also going to point out that there's somewhat of a continuum between SAA and TPA, and so I'm going to play both sides of this, and you can tell me what resonates with you. I think the single biggest difference between a TPA type approach and an SAA approach is the governance dimension. Full stop. Right? SAA, strategic asset allocation, at its heart, it's an investment only construct. Right? It's got a through line from Markowitz's MPT and Sharpe's CAPM straight to what we're doing today. It's investment only. And for many investors, it's asset only. So the connection with the objective or the liability is more of an abstraction rather than a very, very strong mechanical linkage. So I think that that's a super important concept to recognize, that when we talk about strategic asset allocation, classically, it's really an investment only approach because that's what investment teams have control over. And for many, it's asset only. My read is that TPA combines organizational design and the thoughtful allocation of decision rights. And by doing those two things, it much more clearly defines what does success look like at the top level, right? Success is not necessarily just beating a benchmark or having a particular asset class sleeve have outperformance against its rolled up benchmark, or even delivering a certain total return to the portfolio. Right? Success may mean we are able to fund retirements for our participants. We are able to send our children to college. We are able to buy that vacation home if that's your hope and dream and your objective for your personal portfolio. Right. So the linkage, the more concrete linkage of those two things is crucial. I think that that's where TPA differs. It's much more all encompassing. Now, we can talk about multiple objectives that can be put into TPA, I think, a lot more easily than strategic asset allocation. That's another area that maybe isn't the number one or number two or number three, but it's certainly an area of difference that TPA explicitly accounts for having multiple objective functions. And this is something that may be beyond the scope technically of what we're talking about, but if we have time to get into it, I would love to later on. Traditionally, strategic asset allocation collapses the investment problem down into how do I get the most return for a given level of risk. That ignores how much liquidity you need, what sort of inflation exposure you want, how complex the vehicles are, and potentially what the opportunity set is. And there's lots of other things that we can add on to that. In TPA, there is the ability to explicitly have those multiple objectives as part of the why are we here and why are we doing it. Historically, those other objectives, the secondary and the tertiary objectives, have been bolted on to strategic asset allocation, either through the use of constraints or by defining things upstream before you even get to any sort of risk return trade-off or optimization model. So that's another kind of critical, but not the most critical area. And I do want to point out here that I don't view TPA and SAA as being in opposition to each other. There's not this like antagonistic relationship between them. Just like active and passive are on a continuum, public assets and private assets are on a continuum, I think the TPA and SAA can be on a continuum as well. And let me kind of bring this point home. So for over a decade, I've been arguing and telling anybody that would listen that I believe strategic asset allocation should utilize and emphasize super asset classes. right? And by super asset classes, I mean a very broad spectrum definition of what an asset class is. All global public equities, all global public fixed income, some of your privates and your real assets, a handful of things that you then very clearly define what your view for the future of these is in terms of risk and return and correlation and other objectives. And you put that together into an optimization framework that actually works. That's really similar to TPA, right? And it's not that big of a leap to say if you have a very simple super asset class strategic asset allocation framework, that looks and smells and tastes a lot like a reference portfolio, right? Whether that reference portfolio is defined in terms of asset classes or factors. So that's that. I think that that is a point of tangency between a TPA approach and an SAA approach. So you can sort of extend SAA to you get almost to the border of a TPA approach in terms of the investment piece, but you're still missing the governance piece.
Yeah, I think that's so well said because I've heard it. I've heard it say similarly, Gene, that TPA is a fund model and SAA is an investment model. So by definition, it's encapsulating a broader set of features. You mentioned org design and separation of responsibilities and all of these cultural and governance implications that SAA, no offense to it, was never designed to opine on or speak to, right? So with that in mind, from investment model to fund model, if you like that comparison, if that's at least in the right zip code, let's talk a little bit about the implications for an investment manager, an asset manager, a GP, because I think a lot of, at least Kaya's work has been on the asset owner models and journey and resistance overcoming, some of the changes. You said it well. This is about exposures and solutioning versus products fitting in buckets, like SAA somewhat requires or at least encourages. When you think about engaging with a TPA shop on an asset owner side, what does that mean as far as your language, your approach, how you measure success, the benchmarking, given that they are now asking, expecting a very different dynamic with you than an SAA shop?
Yeah, no, so this question has literally consumed my entire career in asset management, is how to help clients solve problems and define things not in terms of like products and building blocks and exposures, but actually getting to the like what is keeping them up at night, what are they trying to solve, answering the right question sometimes versus the question that's on the table. So I've had the luxury of always being part of solutions organizations. My first job after business school, I came back to Barclays Global Investors. I was part of what I think was one of the first solutions organizations in an asset manager. I learned a lot there, and really this solutions mindset. I became very immersed in it, very steeped in it, and so I've carried that lens with me throughout my career. And there's such a sharp contrast between being an arm's length transactional parts provider for an asset owner versus a strategic partner that requires a consultative engagement and a much deeper awareness of what's going on. And I want to break this down into a couple of different points here. You and I have probably observed very, very skillful, focused asset managers with strong track records in their areas that are myopically focused on what they do really well, but have very little context or awareness for the big picture problem that the asset owner is trying to solve. They may be an amazing, let's use an example here, US equity deep value shop or a private equity firm focusing on venture. They may be great at what they do. And when they talk to an asset owner, they use the kind of the contextual language of what they do and hope that that resonates with somebody across the table that is equally skilled in speaking that language and can then take that and translate it to what does this mean for the whole portfolio. I think that as TPA gains more adherence, and by the way, even if it doesn't, even if so many asset owners don't get to the promised land of TPA, but they're thinking in more of this kind of solutions mindset, what you're going to find is a greater awareness is required for what the asset owner is actually trying to do. Are they trying to be more liability driven? Do they have inflation exposure that they're seeking that they might not be getting? Are they looking for more diversification within their manager sleeves to help them in a different part of the portfolio that you have no visibility into at all, right? It's being able to really think at a different altitude. It's not where do you fit in the asset class sleeve that you happen to play in, speaking with maybe the investment staff that are, again, very skilled at underwriting those types of managers. It's taking a step back and almost asking yourself, if I were the CIO for this asset owner, what am I worried about? And how do I move the needle with the capabilities that I, the asset manager, have at my disposal internally? How do I marshal those capabilities in a way that actually helps the asset owner accomplish what they need? So, emphasis on awareness, and there's a couple of other points I'd love to make too on that. So, being able to understand how your investment organization and your investment results are viewed by the asset owner is crucial. I've seen this in multiple organizations that I've been a part of, and I've underwritten managers when I was on the consulting side as well. That the way that you view what you bring to the table and what your results are aren't necessarily the same way that the asset owner views them. And we talked about this earlier with risk systems, right? If an asset owner has a sophisticated risk system, or if they have a gatekeeper or a consultant that can help them with that, they will be evaluating you and your strategies in ways that perhaps you're not looking at them the same way internally. And so bridging that gap, I think, is really important. Having the awareness, understanding how am I being evaluated? What does success mean, right? From the asset owner's perspective versus from your perspective. And I think that an emphasis on risk and on risk factors are really, really important. I've seen this through the lens of quantitative managers that have that in their DNA. They're pretty good at being able to express that to the market. For other more traditional asset managers and those that deal in asset classes that don't really lend themselves to a quantitative approach, that's not an excuse. You need to be able to understand what are the risk factor exposures of your strategy, what sort of exposures do you bring to the asset owner portfolio. So there's really this multi-dimensional understanding of, as the asset owner, I'm assembling a collection of strategies. They need to be coherent. How can I help in that coherence? So again, first understanding what the asset owner's problem are. That this is not a product pitch. This is not a transactional relationship. And then being able to understand how you really fit in. And I've observed that there's been a long running convergence from trying to be a parts provider to trying to be a partner. That this is something that's been going on for my entire career. I don't think that we're all there yet, but we're certainly moving in that direction. But being able to zoom out and ask yourself, what am I solving for? How do I go beyond just filling a perceived gap in the portfolio? And and I think that it's honestly it's really hard to reposition. This takes effort. It takes work. It takes resources. It's a different mindset for asset managers that need to be able to flow into what the asset owner is doing in the framework that they're working in.
I love this transition and journey from parts provider to partner that you've talked about. I think the industry unfortunately throws around the word partner too much, because the partnership you're talking about, capital P, is much wider than I think most GPs think about, most LPs for that matter think about. It includes intangible things. It includes consulting. It includes partnership in areas beyond just providing returns and the way you think about success measurement, et cetera, as you allowed for. It also has other implications, though, that may not be so rosy. And these are the trade-offs of being more bespoke and customized and at your service, Gene. And so I'm curious, maybe just bringing to life how you've thought about that at Capital Group, your talent, your dynamic approach to the customer, how you think about the trade-offs between scale and customization, given that the latter in a TPA model maybe has more pressure on you. So how have you evolved the system and yet still remained economically kind of efficient?
Look, my focus is very at scale and oftentimes sophisticated asset owners. Right? So those types of asset owners, they have always demanded solutions that combine the underlying capabilities of the active manager that aren't necessarily those off-the-shelf parts. So I feel like that part of the market that's already at scale, this is not a new demand. This is not something that's been asked of us recently because of TPA. This has been a long running theme. And obviously, for at scale asset owners, customization is absolutely key. So the scale argument here isn't necessarily being able to do the same thing over and over and over again for these larger organizations. It's being able to find the right mindset and find the right approach to scale the solutioning, if you will. I really hate making verbs out of things, but I've heard solutioning before. I'm going to repeat it here and hopefully not have to say it again. But being able to do that piece of it at scale, I feel like that's the real challenge rather than being able to turn the crank and deliver the same types of parts providers to other elements of the market. So my team, the institutional solutions team, we we provide sufficient scale in those mandates to make customization feasible in most instances. Because again, we're talking about very scalable asks of us. And we've already talked about the partnership mindset a little bit. Our aim, Capital Group's aim, is to be the partner of choice for our institutional clients, right? So we're focusing obviously on the investing piece, but on matching all the capabilities with the Capital Group to those specific needs. And I think you alluded to this a little bit before, providing value beyond investments, right? That's, I think, the true test of a partnership rather than just an off the shelf pre wrapped package that may or may not fit into what the asset owner is looking for. Um, the value beyond investment piece is interesting, and if you want to, we can certainly talk a bit more about that. There's a lot that's contained in there that plays into the consultative strategic partnership that is probably going to be required moving forward.
Well, Gene, you talked a little bit about the reality that TPA is not myopically focused on benchmarks or micro asset class bogeys any longer. Again, you're not selling parts or products; you're selling solutions and a relationship. But I'm going to ask you to benchmark an LPGP relationship 5 years from now, because by definition, everything we've been talking about requires a very different approach that you just alluded to from the Cap Group perspective. But I'd like you maybe to widen that aperture a little bit, if you don't mind, as we close here, and tell us a little bit about what will define a successful GP and how they engage with and approach and service tomorrow's TPA LP.
The onus is not just on the asset owner and not just on the asset manager, to use your parlance, the GP and the LP. The onus is shared across them. And I think that if I could pick one word to describe what is going to define these relationships going forward, it's really clarity. The asset owner or GP having clarity about what they need and what they want, and the asset manager or LP having the clarity to understand what they bring to the table and how they fit in and how they deliver. Right? So the overall construct, I think, is going to be fewer but deeper relationships. Right? Relationships take time and effort, and they involve people and not just numbers. Right? So there's elements of that to it as well. Asset owners have a finite amount of resources, whether you're talking about time or staff or being able to tolerate headache. So having these fewer but very deep relationships with asset managers that have clarity around what success actually means. I also believe that increasingly flexible mandates that span regions, sectors, and these other silo walls that a TPA or an enlightened SAA approach hopes to break down, that flexibility is going to be really important and brings you away from some of that micro benchmarking that you were talking about earlier. I think that even more consultative engagements, right, with meaningful knowledge sharing and sometimes knowledge transfer as well, it's going to be huge. And maybe to cap all of that off, if you think about the comparative advantages for the asset owner, for the GP versus comparative advantages for the asset manager, the LP, right? If is as you think about sort of what that looks like, it seems like the asset manager who's in the flow, who's thinking through all of these different aspects of their investment program, they would have a lot to add at a higher altitude for the asset manager. Sorry, for the asset owner that is thinking at a much higher altitude about how does this connect to my objectives and am I meeting all of these obligations? How am I structuring this portfolio? So thinking about who brings what to the table and how they could potentially come together and really play well there.